In today's podcast, we intend to explain some common verbs that are followed by gerunds and the ones that are followed by infinitives so that you can avoid making mistakes when speaking English. Welcome to
Aprender Inglés with Reza and Craig.
Hi, I'm Reza.
And my name's Craig.
And with nearly 60 years of teaching between us, we'll help you improve your English and take it to the next level. How are you, Craig?
I'm very well, thank you. I enjoyed your introduction there with examples of gerunds infinitives. I'm looking forward to getting into some grammar discussion with you today. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. I really enjoyed that cup of coffee that you've just given me with those really tasty homemade biscuits. They were delicious.
Well, thank you very much. Pleased you enjoyed them. So let's look at gerunds and infinitives. Now, we have spoken about them in the past, but we didn't really go into a lot of detail. So we think it's time that we looked at gerunds and infinitives in detail so that you can understand them properly and know how to use them. Let's start off with the basics, Reza. What is a gerund?
I think the best definition is to say a gerund is the ing form of a verb that functions as a noun. I'll give you an example. Swimming is my favorite activity. So here we've got the word swimming, and it acts as the subject of the sentence. Swimming, that's the subject. Then we got the verb is, and then the rest, my favorite activity. I could have said, for example, football is my favorite activity. Football is obviously a noun, isn't it? But swimming comes from the verb to swim, but I'm using it as if it were a noun, like the word football. If I do that, then I have to use the gerund. I have to use the ing form of the verb.
You could also say podcasting is your favorite activity. Podcasting is a lot of fun. So these gerunds, these ing forms, they can be used in different ways. Let's look at some of the ways they can be used. For example, they can be used as the subject of a sentence, as Reza just demonstrated. Another example, eating healthily is important. Smoking is bad for you. Swimming is my favorite activity. So those are all examples of one use of the gerund as the subject of a sentence.
So that's fairly obvious, isn't it? That's easy. That's like a rule. If you use it as if it were the subject of a sentence, it's a gerund. Now we begin to get into tricky territory. Our second point is that gerunds go after certain verbs. Not all verbs, after certain verbs. For example, after suggest or after enjoy, you can use a gerund. For example, he enjoys eating biscuits. She suggested doing a podcast about gerunds and infinitives. So after the verb enjoy, I said eating, gerund, and after suggested, I used gerund, doing. So now you're thinking, okay, great. So what's the rule? No rule. I wish there were, because after other verbs, we have infinitives sometimes. So it's like this. You either know it or you don't, I'm afraid to say. Some verbs are followed by a gerund, and you either know them or you don't. But don't despair, listeners. With lots of listening practice or reading practice, you will become familiar with the verbs which are followed by a gerund, and eventually you will remember them.
And I'm sure you know some of them already, and we're going to look at the more common ones in this episode. But before that, another use of gerunds after prepositions. After any preposition, when you put a verb, it's going to be in the ing form. For example, he's good at speaking English. Here we've got the preposition at. Speak is the verb. At speaking. Good at speaking, good at doing, good at running, good at swimming. Another example with interested. Interested is commonly followed by the preposition in, to be interested in something. But if it's followed by a verb, the preposition is followed by a verb, ing. For example, I'm interested in taking an exam. Another example, thinking of. I'm thinking of. What are you thinking of, Craig? I'm thinking of going to Thailand. So of is the preposition, go is the verb, thinking of going to Thailand.
That's my favorite use, number 3, because there are no exceptions. So listeners, don't forget that one. That's a great rule. If you want to use a verb after a preposition, it must be a gerund and there are no exceptions. A good rule. It's a nice one. The next point we have isn't so much a use, it's just something we wanted to point out. You can use other words with gerunds. In other words, a gerund can go with a noun phrase, or it can go with an object pronoun, or it can go with a possessive word when needed. Let me give you an example. I like cooking Sunday lunch. That doesn't have a noun phrase or an object pronoun or a possessive. It simply was an ing, right? I like cooking Sunday lunch. What about this? I'm very lazy. I like my wife cooking Sunday lunch. Not me. I like my wife cooking Sunday lunch.
Is that an example or a true fact?
It could be true. Well, at first I would need to get a wife, I guess. But I like cooking Sunday lunch. It's implied that I cook the lunch. But you can put a noun phrase which acts like a subject of the gerund, if you like, the person responsible for the gerund. So not me, I'm lazy. I like my wife cooking Sunday lunch. So my wife goes before the gerund cooking. So sometimes we do add other words with gerunds when necessary.
So let's move to infinitives. What's an infinitive? An infinitive is the base form of the verb, and it's often with to. So to plus verb. For example, to swim. I like to swim. To swim is the infinitive. To eat. I like to eat biscuits. To eat is the infinitive. So when do we use infinitives? Well, you can use an infinitive as the subject or the complement. For example, to learn a new language takes time. To learn is the infinitive. It's at the front, at the beginning of the sentence, and it acts as the subject. To learn a new language takes time.
Now, I bet there are very observant listeners out there who are thinking, hold on a minute, what did they say about 3 minutes ago? When they were talking about the use of gerunds, use number 1, didn't they say for gerunds, number 1, as the subject of a sentence? Yes, we did.
Yeah, we did.
We did. Eating healthy is important. Smoking is bad for you, gerund. And hold on, did Craig not just say to learn a new language? But that's infinitive. Yep, I'm afraid to say you can use gerunds as a subject of a sentence and you can use infinitives. You can say to learn a new language takes time, or you can say learning a new language takes time.
And before we started recording this podcast, Reza and I had a very interesting discussion during coffee about the difference. Is there a difference between using the infinitive or the gerund? For example, in this sentence, to learn a new language or learning a new language? Well, I think there is. I think that to learn a new language, first of all, sounds a bit more formal. Do you agree with that?
With infinitive, to learn?
Infinitive is a bit more formal.
A bit more formal,
To learn a new language takes time. And also, in many situations with the infinitive, you're focusing on the purpose rather than the action. When you're using the gerund, it's very active, as we know from the present continuous, for example, with the ing form. It's usually the activity, the action, you're doing something. And also with the gerund, I think there's more focus on the activity, the learning of the language or the swimming. You're focusing more on the activity, not so much on the purpose or the reason for doing it. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, That's what I would say is the difference. Although sometimes the difference isn't clear, it can be a bit ambiguous. There are many occasions where it wouldn't really matter. It wouldn't really make a difference if you said to learn a new language takes time or learning a new language takes time. On most occasions, there wouldn't really be much difference in reality.
I agree, 100%. We can also use the infinitive after some adjectives. Difficult is an adjective. I can say it's difficult to speak Chinese, or it's difficult to learn Chinese. So after difficult, infinitive. To speak, to learn. It's hard to do it. It's easy to love someone, for example. So after adjectives, you can use the infinitive. Another example, how lovely to see you. Lovely is an adjective. How lovely to see you.
Now, you will hear a lot of people incorrectly using a gerund after adjectives. You'll hear it, but I don't think it's really correct. But don't be surprised if you hear a sentence like this. Oh, it's easy saying I love you, but do you really mean it? Didn't we just say it should be infinitive? It's easy to say I love you. Yes, but some people do sometimes put a gerund after an adjective. I don't think it's technically correct, but we sometimes do it as well.
Yeah, we do. Another use of the infinitive is to explain the reason or the purpose for something. As I mentioned earlier, why do we do things? Why are you listening to this podcast? Well, we hope that you're listening to this podcast to improve your English. That's the reason. That's called the infinitive of purpose. Why did I leave early this morning when I went to work? Why did I leave early? Well, I left early to avoid the traffic. The infinitive to avoid, that's the reason, that's the purpose why I left early.
A classic mistake of Spanish speakers with this is to put in the word for, isn't it, Craig? Spanish speakers will say, I left early for, and they think, oh, for is para, they think. And then they think, for is a preposition. After for, ing, for avoiding. But no, we don't think of it that way in English. It's the infinitive of purpose. Forget about para in English. If it's the reason why, the purpose, it's infinitive. That's all you need to know in English.
What did Batman's father tell him? Why do we fall, Bruce? Why do we fall? To get up again and start from the beginning. So that's the reason, to do something. Yeah.
And Craig, why did the chicken cross the road?
To get to the other side.
Yeah, not forgetting, to get.
Let's take a break here. I hope you're enjoying listening to this podcast. Did you notice that? Enjoy plus gerund. Enjoy listening to this podcast. I want to take a very short break, and I can't help noticing these verb patterns. I want to take. There's another one, infinitive. I want to take a short break to tell you how you can take your speaking to the next level. If you haven't listened to this podcast before, you may not know that you can participate in online conversation courses with me and a small group of lovely, motivated students on Zoom. And together we'll have discussions, debates, role plays, fun activities that are all designed to help make you a better and more confident English speaker. Now, if this sounds like something you might be interested in, send me an email. My address is Craig, CRAIG, @inglespodcast.com, and I'll give you more details. If we haven't spoken before, I'll invite you to book a short, free Zoom consultation with me so that I can give you more information and also get an idea of your English level. I really hope to speak to you soon. There's another one. I hope to speak to you soon on the inside. And now, let's get back to the grammar. So there's another reason, isn't there, Reza? After some certain verbs, not all, but some verbs, and this is the tricky area that we're going to look at today. So what kind of examples can you think of where we use the infinitive after some verbs?
After, for example, want, I want to improve my handwriting. So want plus infinitive, to improve. Also with hope, I hope to see you soon. To see is infinitive because it's a verb after hope. So after want, after hope, followed by infinitive. And as we said earlier, other verbs are followed by an ing, like suggest. You just have to learn these and practice them, and then eventually you will remember which is which.
So let me run something by you, Reza. To run something by someone is to make a suggestion to see if Reza agrees. Do you agree with this? My theory is that we often use the infinitive after verbs when the first verb has some kind of reference to the future. Look at want. If you want something, that's something that you want in the future. I want to go, I want to buy, I want to have, I want to see. The same with hope. That's a future thing, isn't it? If you're hoping, that's probably about something that you want to happen in the future. Intend, intend to. Plan, plan to. There are many verbs that are followed by the infinitive that have a future connotation. Do you think that's true?
It's true. But I think we have to clarify something because I've said that many times and then I've caused problems. Although, yes, infinitive refers to a future action, it could be a future that's in the past. Let me explain. There's no reason why the original verb can't be past simple. For example, when I was younger, I wanted to be a musician. But no. I'm talking about my future thoughts when I was younger. I wanted to be a musician when I was younger, but now I don't. Now I want to be a rich retired man. It's about a later action, which may be in the future, but it may be in the past. Think of it as a later action. You can have an infinitive following a past simple. It doesn't have to be following a present or a future. So I wanted to be a musician, but now I just want to be rich.
I want to be a rich musician.
Yeah. No, I want to be a rich retired person and do nothing and just listen to music.
If I were a rich man. Okay, let's look at some examples then of verbs that are followed by a gerund. Okay, verbs that are followed by a gerund, and these are the more common ones that you might use or know or come across. For example, enjoy. I enjoy going out with friends. I enjoy podcasting with Reza. What's the next word, Reza?
Suggest. You could say, he suggested going to the Thai restaurant. But you don't have to use an ing after suggest. You could say, he suggested that we go, and just use a present simple. So you don't have to use an ing after suggest, but you can use an ing after suggest. He suggested going to the Thai restaurant. I'll tell you what you can't do. You cannot use an infinitive after suggest. Now that's wrong. You can't say to go. That's wrong. So you can say he suggested going, or you can say he suggested that we go to the Thai restaurant.
And if you want to avoid problems, maybe the easiest thing to do with this list of verbs that we say are followed by a gerund, which they are, is always to follow these verbs with a gerund. I enjoy doing it. I suggest going. Also with the verb avoid. Here's an example for you. I left early to avoid getting stuck in traffic. Now there I've mixed an infinitive and a gerund. The first verb here is leave, but it's in the past. I left my house early. I left early. Why? Infinitive of purpose, to avoid. And after avoid, use a gerund. Getting stuck in traffic. I left early to avoid getting stuck in traffic. To see all these examples, go to the show notes. You'll find those at inglespodcast.com/553.
Another verb that you can use with a gerund is recommend. For example, he recommended them leaving on the next plane.
Them is not necessary. You can take that out, can't you?
Depends. Good question.
He recommended leaving?
Okay. Depends who's speaking to who, though.
True.
It all depends on the context. He recommended them leaving on the next plane, but he recommended me staying here. It all depends. Yep, you could leave it out. You could. So that goes back to what I was saying in use of gerund, the fourth point. Sometimes, if necessary, you might need to put in a pronoun. He recommended them leaving on the next plane, but he didn't recommend me leaving. I wonder why not. It all depends on the context. So I could say he recommended leaving. That's good grammar. I could say he recommended them leaving. That's also good grammar. I could also say, by the way, he recommended that they leave. That would also be good grammar. So it's like suggest. It could also go with that plus simply a present simple. But one possibility is recommend plus a gerund.
Our next two, I want to put these two together because they are quite similar. One's a verb, one's a structure. Fancy, the verb to fancy, is followed by a gerund. And also the expression to feel like. They're very similar words. For example, I feel like studying today. Or the negative, I don't feel like studying today. Maybe more common. And to fancy, I fancy going for lunch this weekend. Or what do you fancy for lunch today? So fancy and feel like, very similar use, and both of those followed by gerunds.
Another word followed by a gerund often is mind. For example, I don't mind reading your 200-page thesis and checking your English for you. Can I just point out that that's an example? It's not actually true.
Oh, I thought you might like that example as, you're offering to check long thesis of students in your classes. You welcome that, don't you, Reza?
I'm a bit worried about receiving 8,000 theses to check. I would mind, I'm afraid. But as an example, I could say, I don't mind. That means it's not a problem for me. I don't mind plus ing. Reading your 200-page thesis and checking your English for you. Mind plus ing.
So you don't fancy doing that before Christmas?
No, I don't know if I'd have time, to be honest.
Also, the verb consider is followed by a gerund. Here's an example. Have you considered joining one of my conversation courses? So join is the verb, becomes a gerund, joining. Have you considered joining one of my conversation courses?
A very common verb with a gerund is keep. For example, she keeps asking the same question. That means she repeatedly does it. If you repeat an action a lot, you keep doing it. So keep plus an ing. She keeps asking. You can, if you want, also add the preposition on. You can say she keeps on asking the same question.
And it's usually something that's annoying, isn't it? It's something that gets on your nerves to keep on doing something. He knew he was wrong, but he kept on doing it anyway. He kept on arguing. Another verb that's followed by a gerund, very commonly, is miss. Here's a personal example. I really miss teaching students in a real classroom. I miss the atmosphere of having people in the same room. I miss doing activities with the whiteboard and having people move chairs. I really miss teaching students in a real classroom.
Finish is a very common verb, which goes with a gerund, ing. For example, he finished marking his students' essays before midnight. That sounds like me. Yesterday I finished at about 11:50. So I just about finished marking my students' essays before midnight. Finish plus ing, marking, for example.
And then after that, you helped me with the show notes for today's podcast. So I got a message from Reza last night. He'd finished checking and adding to these show notes at about 20 to 1.
About that, yeah.
Yeah, impressive. So those are some common verbs that are followed by a gerund. Let's move now to some common verbs followed by an infinitive. Want is often followed by an infinitive. For example, I want to learn more about grammar. Now, this can be a problem for some students when you forget the to. Very often I hear my students say, I want learn, or I want go, or I want eat. Remember that to with the infinitive. I want to learn, I want to go, I want to eat, I want to do.
Hope is another verb followed by an infinitive. For example, we hope to get some voice messages from you next week. That definitely is true. We love getting voice messages and we hope to get many from you in the future.
Let's look at a negative now. Now, to make these infinitives negative, add the word not. So with the verb promise, which is another verb followed by the infinitive, I promise not to eat any more chocolate biscuits.
Really?
No, this is an example, and I'm not legally responsible for any examples written in today's show notes. I promise to do my best. I promise to send you an email. Or the negative, I promise not to do it.
Agree also goes with an infinitive. For example, you agreed to do it yesterday. Agreed to do, infinitive.
Have you ever agreed to do something and regretted it afterwards?
Oh, many times in my life. Many times. And you?
Correcting a 200-page student thesis, perhaps.
Yes.
Yeah. I hope you haven't ever regretted doing this podcast.
No, that's something I've never regretted doing.
We'll look at regret plus gerund next week. Regret plus gerund, regret doing. Expect is followed by the infinitive. I don't expect to hear from the builder anytime soon. And if you've had any dealings with and conversations with the builders, you'll know how true this sentence sometimes is. I don't expect to hear from the builder anytime soon. And expect is another verb that I mentioned before that has a future connotation like hope or intend or plan, because you usually expect in the future.
I always expect builders to damage something while they're fixing something else. I've taken it for granted. It's just happened right now in my block of flats. Builders are installing a lift, finally, an elevator, a lift. And I expected them to break something or to damage something. And yes, this morning I noticed there was a big unfortunately, dry puddle of glue adhesive that they've spilled. And goodness knows how we're going to get it off the stairs. Okay, it's very good that we're getting a lift and we won't need the stairs so much now. But I didn't want it to be a huge sticky puddle on the stairs. Can they ever fix one thing without breaking another? I don't know.
Don't step in the glue. You might be there for weeks. Another verb is decide. For example, I decided to become a Patreon supporter of this podcast. If you have, thank you very much. So after decide, use the infinitive. I decided to go on holiday in January next year.
To refuse means that you will not do something. For example, I refuse to be spoken to in that tone of voice. There's a lot of words there that probably need explanation for you. First of all, I refuse. Why not to speak? Well, because it's a passive infinitive. I'm not doing the speaking. I'm talking about how other people speak to me. So there we got an infinitive. We're following our rule. Yeah, refuse plus an infinitive. But it's a passive infinitive. Don't worry. If you speak Spanish, it's the same as the Spanish system. It's just the verb to be plus the past participle. To speak, to be spoken. To eat, to be eaten. To stop, to be stopped, etc. It's easy. I refuse to be spoken to in that tone of voice. To speak to someone, right? So I refuse to be spoken to. And then the second bit is in that tone of voice. In other words, in that way. So there's a lot of little words there, prepositions to, in, infinitive to, but it makes sense. I refuse, infinitive, to be spoken, preposition to, and then prepositional phrase in that tone of voice.
The reason I included that example, Reza, was because it's connected to a joke that I like.
Oh, what's the joke?
I left my job at the helium factory.
Why is that?
I refuse to be spoken to in that tone of voice.
Very good.
Offer. To offer is another verb that's followed by the infinitive. For example, Reza offered to help me. I asked him and he offered to help me.
Seem is another one with infinitive. Everyone seems to be interested. So we got there the verb to be plus the adjective interested.
Manage is another verb followed by the infinitive. For example, she managed to pass the exam. To manage can have different meanings. You can manage a business, but in this context, it means to be able to do something. So she was able to pass the exam, or she managed to pass the exam.
Plan is another important verb which is commonly used, and that goes with an infinitive. For example, I plan to go to Liverpool in April.
Oh, me too.
Actually, this is Craig's sentence. I stole his script. I don't plan to go.
I'm planning to go. So it doesn't matter if you use the different form of the verb, it's still followed by infinitive. So here's the present continuous. I'm planning to go to Liverpool in April. That's true.
We could even say he has planned to go.
Yes.
It doesn't matter what form of the verb you use before. It's followed by infinitive. I plan to go, I plan to go, I will plan to go, I am planning to go, I will have planned to go. The verb form is irrelevant. It's followed by infinitive.
Our last verb on the list, followed by an infinitive, is expect, another verb that kind of speaks about the future, if you think about it. We expect to be back next week with another podcast. We hope to be back. We plan to be back next week with another podcast. But now it's your turn to practice your English. We'd love to hear from you. Why don't you send us a voice message and try to use verb plus infinitive. Try to use some of the verbs in this episode. You can do that by going to speakpipe.com. That's speakpipe.com/English podcast, and you have 90 seconds to leave us your voice message. Emails, Reza?
Emails could be sent to craig@englishpodcast.com or belfastreza@gmail.com.
And if you're a Spanish speaker, and we know many of you are, and you want to improve your English, there's another example I noticed of verb plus infinitive. With free and paid resources, why not visit the Mansion Inglés website? It's at mansioninglés.com. And for paid products, you can browse the online store at store.mansioninglés.net.
As always, we'd like to say thank you to all our supporters on the Patreon scheme. And the people on the Patreon program, they donate money every month. And as a way of saying thank you for their donation, they get instant access to the audio transcriptions of the episodes. And as an initiative we started quite recently, they also get a live Zoom chat, if they like, so that they can practice speaking. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, a supporter, have a look at the link in the show notes, which is patreon.com/English podcast.
And before we go out the door today, we'd like to say a huge thank you and show our appreciation for our lovely Patreon supporters who have joined us this month. They are David Santana Rubiales, Ezequiel, Fatima, Angeles, Genesis Cañizares, and Priscilla. Thank you to you and to all of our Patreon supporters. Reza, what's next week?
Next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about gerunds and infinitives, but specifically those with a change in meaning.
And we just had one before with try. That's one verb we're going to look at next week. So please try to listen next week and we'll explain some of those verbs. Until next time, thank you so much for keeping us company this week. Have a lovely week. And it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.
The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.